The sun dipped low over Manila, casting golden streaks across the cathedral where Althea stood, a vision of elegance in her flowing white gown. Guests whispered praises, cameras clicked incessantly, and Mark's eyes sparkled with pride, or so it seemed. On the surface, everything was perfect. The flowers, meticulously arranged, swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and the music played softly, an ethereal soundtrack to a day meant for celebration. Yet beneath Althea's calm smile, a storm churned, barely contained. She had dreamt of this day countless times, each vision more flawless than the last, yet reality already carried the first shadows of unease. Mark approached, adjusting his bow tie, his smile practiced, rehearsed even. He took her hand with the kind of gentleness reserved for those who have something to hide. Althea's heart thudded, not with joy, but with the uneasy awareness that she was stepping into a life already tinged with secrets. She forced her lips into a smile as cameras focused, capturing the image of two perfect lovers. But every glance, every whispered compliment from friends and family gnawed at a hidden edge. She remembered fleeting suspicions from before the wedding, tiny inconsistencies in Mark's words, secretive phone calls, moments when his attention drifted. She had dismissed them as nerves, the pre-wedding jitters that often plagued grooms. Now, amid the laughter and clinking glasses, those doubts refused to be ignored. Guests moved through the hall, complimenting the couple, sharing stories of their own marriages and experiences. Althea nodded politely, her mind scanning faces, noting expressions, cataloging reactions. Everything was under observation. The chandeliers glimmered above, their crystals reflecting light like fractured truths. She imagined herself walking through a labyrinth of deceit, each turn revealing another secret, and other betrayal waiting to be unearthed. Her stomach tightened as she pictured what might lie ahead, not the happily ever after promised by the vows, but a web of hidden infidelities and unspoken lies. Mark leaned closer, whispering something meant to soothe her jitters. She nodded, barely hearing the words, her thoughts elsewhere. There was a tension beneath his hand on hers, subtle but unmistakable, a pulse that hinted at guilt, a tremor betraying the composure he displayed outwardly. Althea's mind flickered to the rumors she had heard, the faint whisper of a name that shouldn't belong to her life, yet had appeared in the shadows of her reality. The thought made her chest tighten, her hands curl slightly around the bouquet. She glanced at the crowd, smiling mechanically as the photographer barked instructions, her gaze landing on familiar faces, oblivious to the storm gathering in her eyes. The ceremony began, and vows were exchanged with a mechanical perfection, words laden with promises neither wholly believed. Althea's voice was steady, her gaze unwavering, but inside, the seeds of doubt had already taken root. She watched Mark carefully, memorizing each inflection, each subtle twitch, aware that this moment, though celebrated by all, was merely the opening act of a drama that had only just begun. Behind the golden ribbons and delicate lace, behind the laughter and the shared joy, a quiet tension simmered, unseen by anyone else, but as palpable as the heat of the afternoon sun. In the midst of perfection, a darker narrative waited, ready to unfold. The day after the wedding, Manila's humid air clung to Althea like a second skin, suffocating and heavy. She moved through the house, now officially a home, with a smile that fooled everyone around her. Friends commented on how radiant she looked, how perfect the day had been. Yet as she poured tea for Mark, she noticed the subtle shift in his behavior, the flicker of distraction in his eyes, the way his fingers lingered over his phone longer than necessary, the faint tension in his shoulders when she entered the room. Small things, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but they gnawed at her with a precision she couldn't ignore. She remembered the nights before the wedding, the casual mentions of colleagues and late work meetings that had seemed harmless at first. Now, in the quiet hum of their apartment, the details stacked against each other like a fragile tower ready to collapse. Althea's mind raced through conversations, half-heard phrases, and cryptic messages she had brushed off as trivial. Each one now shimmered with possibility, a secret waiting to be unveiled. She forced herself to laugh at Mark's attempts at charm, though the laughter felt hollow, a mask hiding the storm within. The city outside pulsed with life, oblivious to the tension in the apartment. Cars honked, vendors shouted over the crowded streets, and yet inside, time seemed suspended. Althea noticed the way Mark avoided her gaze during breakfast, his attention divided between a coffee cup and a phone screen that never seemed to rest. Her pulse quickened, the faint chill of dread crawling up her spine. She had learned to read the spaces between words, to hear the pauses that spoke louder than any confession. Something was wrong, and she intended to uncover it. As she walked through the rooms, Althea found herself cataloging the moments she had once dismissed. Mark's subtle smirks, hurried pas, or tours, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. Each whisper of doubt coiled tighter around her thoughts, feeding a growing unease that would not be silenced. She tried to dismiss the rising suspicion, telling herself that paranoia could ruin even the strongest relationships. But the seed had been planted, and it thrived in the quiet spaces where no one else could see. By the afternoon, the tension had escalated to an almost tangible weight. Althea observed Mark's every movement, noting how he lingered near the window, checking his phone with deliberate care, smiling too quickly when friends called. A subtle, unspoken battle of awareness began, a silent duel in which Althea refused to remain ignorant. Her heart pounded as fragments of intuition pieced themselves into an emerging picture, one that hinted at betrayal far deeper than she had imagined. As night fell and the city lights flickered on, Althea lay awake, replaying moments from the day, each one a puzzle piece that refused to fit neatly. She clenched her fists beneath the covers, the faintest tremor of determination coursing through her. The realization had begun to crystallize. Her perfect wedding might have been a prelude to the unraveling of truths far darker than she could yet name. And somewhere, hidden just beyond the reach of polite smiles, waited a secret that would change everything. The morning sunlight spilled across the bedroom, but it offered no warmth to Althea. Her eyes burned from restless sleep, and a gnawing unease settled deep in her chest. Mark was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and a neatly folded shirt on the dresser. She picked up his phone, hidden beneath a pile of clothes, with a trembling hand, convincing herself it was a harmless curiosity. But the messages she found there were anything but harmless. A name blinked at her from the screen. Laura. Heart hammering, Althea opened the thread. Words flowed like poison, sweet and intimate, secrets shared in the dead of night. Mark's words carried familiarity, affection, and betrayal, all directed at a woman she had never met. Each sentence was a dagger, and Althea felt the full weight of humiliation crash over her. The coffee she had poured minutes ago now trembled in her hands, spilling a dark ribbon across the countertop. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing against her as though mocking the perfect image she had clung to for so long. Her mind spun, memories colliding with the present. Tiny inconsistencies suddenly made sense. The late nights at work, the whispered phone calls, the way he had laughed too easily at messages no one else could see. Every detail she had dismissed now screamed betrayal. Althea's hands shook as she scrolled, each revelation a fresh wound. She could almost hear the soft laughter, the imagined whispers between Mark and Laura, slicing through the veneer of her reality. Anger, sharp and acrid, coiled in her chest, mingling with a sorrow she had tried to suppress. By afternoon, Althea had pieced together fragments of Mark's double life. The apartment seemed alien, every familiar corner tainted with secrets. Even the photographs of their wedding, once symbols of joy, now stared back at her like reminders of deception. He clutched the albums to her chest, eyes brimming with tears, yet her mind was clear with one chilling thought. The woman she had married, the man she had trusted, was not who he appeared to be. The betrayal ran deeper than infidelity. It was a calculated, ongoing deceit. Later that evening, she followed Mark under the guise of casual errands, moving silently behind him through the crowded streets. Her heart pounded in rhythm with her steps, each beat sharpening her focus. She caught glimpses of a young woman entering a nearby cafe, laughing softly at Mark's jokes, leaning close in ways that were not meant for her eyes. Lara. Her presence was undeniable, the embodiment of all the unspoken promises Mark had made, broken without remorse. Althea's stomach churned, a mixture of nausea and a cold, fierce clarity. The world had tilted on its axis, and she stood on the edge of an abyss, staring into a darkness she could no longer ignore. By nightfall, Althea returned to the apartment, the weight of discovery heavy on her shoulders. She paced, her mind oscillating between disbelief and the burgeoning heat of vengeance. She recalled every whisper, every fleeting gesture that had seemed insignificant before, now flashing before her with brutal clarity. The air felt thick, charged, as if anticipating what would come next. Althea sat by the window, city lights casting long shadows across her face. She clenched her fists, determination hardening beneath the shock. The seed of revenge had been planted, watered by betrayal and nourished by humiliation. In that quiet, restless hour, she understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The days ahead would demand choices she had never imagined, decisions that would push her into darkness. And somewhere beyond the glittering skyline, Mark and Lara remained blissfully unaware of the storm that had begun to gather. Althea moved through the apartment with a quiet intensity, her mind calculating, measuring, planning. The revelation of Mark's betrayal had shifted something inside her, a careful, simmering anger that refused to be subdued. She touched the wedding album again, tracing the smiles she once believed were genuine, now hollow facades. Every photograph became a reminder of her humiliation, every memory a tool for the revenge that had begun to take root. The air around her seemed heavier, charged with anticipation, as though the walls themselves held their breath for what was coming. She began observing Mark with the precision of a predator, noting his habits, his routines, the small gestures he took for granted. A cup of coffee left unattended, a message he thought she wouldn't read, the pattern of his phone use, nothing escaped her scrutiny. Each detail fed a growing strategy, a silent preparation for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Althea had always been calm under pressure, but now a new edge sharpened her instincts. There was no turning back. The path forward was clear, jagged as it might be. Her thoughts drifted to Lara, the mistress whose presence had shattered the illusion of her marriage. The way she laughed at Mark's jokes, the way she leaned close without fear. Althea replayed the scene endlessly in her mind. But the anger was not random. It was precise. She considered each encounter, each shared moment she had once ignored or dismissed, turning them over, imagining scenarios in which control shifted. The seed of revenge was no longer merely an idea. It had become a plan, delicate yet lethal in its potential. At night, she walked the streets of Manila alone, blending into the throngs of pedestrians while her mind orchestrated subtle schemes. A misplaced word, a manipulated observation, a carefully staged coincidence. Each step of her revenge was being rehearsed silently. Her thoughts were methodical, almost clinical, yet each was laced with the bitter sting of betrayal. She found herself smiling at possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable before, the thrill of power coursing quietly beneath the surface of her grief. For the first time since the wedding, she felt in control, the chaos of deceit now bending to her will. In the quiet hours, Althea began drafting letters she never intended to send, making notes on possible confrontations, rehearsing the words she would use when the time came. She visualized every angle, every reaction, every slip Mark might make. Each hypothetical scenario built her confidence, a careful architecture of anticipation that left no room for error. Even Laura's routines became a map in her mind, every movement catalogued, every habit noted, feeding the meticulous plan forming in the recesses of Althea's consciousness. The apartment felt different now, suffused with the weight of her intentions. The soft hum of the air conditioner, the muted clatter of dishes, even the faint ticking of the wall clock. It all seemed part of the rhythm of the coming storm. Althea moved deliberately through each room, testing her calm, rehearsing patience. Her mind did not dwell on morality. It did not question right or wrong. The only thing that mattered was precision, preparation, and the inevitable execution of justice she had decided upon. By the 9th day, she was ready. The seed of revenge had matured into a tangible force, poised on the edge of action. She knew Mark would never suspect the quiet transformation taking place, the subtle shift that had transformed a woman wronged into a force capable of irreversible decisions. And somewhere in the distance, hidden behind normalcy and smiles, Laura remained blissfully unaware of the plans that had already begun to take shape. The next days would not be the ordinary, and Althea would ensure they were unforgettable. For the first hours of the day, everything seemed ordinary. Althea moved through the apartment with an effortless composure, preparing breakfast, straightening the living room, exchanging polite words with Mark as though nothing had shifted in the last 9 days. Outside, the city moved in its familiar rhythm. Vendors hawked their goods, jeepneys rattled past, and children's laughter floated through the humid air. To anyone observing, this was a couple settling into newlywed bliss, a picture of normalcy so complete it would have fooled even the most attentive eyes. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered, hidden beneath Althea's poised smile. Each glance from Mark was noted, each casual gesture catalogued. He moved with unthinking habit, unaware that every step he took, every casual message he sent, was being quietly analyzed, filed away in Althea's mind for the moment she had long rehearsed. The apartment felt charged, almost electric, though the sounds of ordinary life pressed in from the streets beyond. Althea was a master of outward calm. Inside, her mind was a storm, circling, calculating, weighing every possibility. She kept herself occupied with minor chores, maintaining the illusion of domestic normalcy. The laundry was folded with precise care, dishes scrubbed until they gleamed, flowers watered and arranged just so. To any observer, she appeared distracted by mundane concerns, perhaps exhausted from the whirlwind of wedding festivities. But every movement, every step was deliberate, a rehearsal in patience, a test of her own control. She measured the tempo of her breathing, the steadiness of her hands, the firmness of her gaze when Mark looked her way. The calm she displayed was both a shield and a weapon, hiding the storm gathering behind her eyes. Althea's thoughts drifted repeatedly to Laura, imagining her laughter, the easy intimacy she shared with Mark. See the audacity of their secret. A cold fury wrapped itself around her chest, but she restrained it, folding it into a deliberate patience. This was the final preparation, the last moment of outward serenity before the inevitable confrontation. Every action was a study in control, the soft clink of cutlery, the muted hum of the ceiling fan, even the distant rumble of traffic. It all contributed to the rhythm of a day that felt poised on the edge of a knife. Even Mark seemed oblivious to the quiet tension. He joked with neighbors, sipped his coffee, and admired the view from the balcony, all while Althea observed from the kitchen doorway. Her gaze followed his every movement, storing information, noting the small habits that would later become critical pieces in the unfolding puzzle. She imagined the upcoming night, rehearsed the words she might use, the expression she would wear, the calculated calm she would maintain until the very moment the facade shattered. By late afternoon, the city's light began to fade, casting long shadows across the apartment. Althea sat by the window, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for answers hidden beyond the skyline. The calm she exuded was unbroken, flawless, but inside, anticipation thrummed like a quiet drumbeat. Every plan, every thought, every ounce of restrained fury had been sharpened to perfection. The final pieces were falling into place. As the day drew to a close, Althea rose and moved through the apartment with deliberate steps, preparing for the night that would change everything. The ordinary had been maintained, the illusion perfected, and yet, beneath it, a storm waited. The calm before the storm was complete, the stage silently set, and the players unaware that the first act of confrontation would begin with the setting of the sun. Tomorrow, the lines would be drawn, and nothing would remain as it once had been. The apartment was quiet, the soft hum of the ceiling fan the only sound punctuating the tense stillness. Althea had prepared the dinner table with meticulous care, the flicker of candlelight casting long, uneven shadows across the walls. Mark arrived later than expected, casual in demeanor, unaware of the careful orchestration around him. He had no idea that the night would strip away the illusion of their marriage, revealing secrets long hidden. Althea watched him from the doorway, her hands folded neatly, her gaze steady, as though nothing had shifted in the days since the wedding. She motioned for him to sit, her smile calm, almost serene, but her mind was a storm of calculation. Mark sank into his chair, glancing at her with that familiar mix of confidence and exhaustion, oblivious to the intensity simmering just beneath the surface. Across the table, Laura's presence was palpable, invited under the guise of casual civility, her laughter and soft words a mask that now felt cruel to Althea. Every movement, every glance, every word was observed, stored, and measured. This was not just a confrontation. It was a test of control, and Althea held all the cards. The conversation began lightly, a veneer of small talk, but tension grew with every word. Althea's questions were pointed, subtle at first, probing cracks in Mark's composure. His responses were smooth, rehearsed, but the briefest falter in tone, the quick glance at Laura, betrayed his unease. Althea noted the micro-expressions, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of guilt behind his eyes, and each one fueled a controlled fury, sharpening the focus she had cultivated over the last 9 days. Laura's laughter, once light and confident, became forced, brittle under the weight of scrutiny. The room seemed smaller with each passing minute, the candlelight elongating shadows, highlighting expressions in ways that made every thought visible. Althea's voice, calm yet edged with authority, cut through the soft music playing from the speakers. She spoke of loyalty, trust, and the invisible threads that tie a marriage together. Mark's hand twitched under the table, his confident mask beginning to crumble. Laura's composure faltered, her smile slipping ever so slightly. Althea pressed on, her questions growing sharper, her words carrying the unspoken weight of all the observations she had catalogued, the messages, the glances, the whispered lies. By the time the main course sat untouched, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The masks were gone, replaced by tension so thick it seemed almost physical. Althea's presence was commanding, her calm fury radiating outward, forcing both Mark and Laura into uncomfortable self-awareness. Every laugh, every casual gesture, every shared glance was scrutinized, twisted into evidence of deceit. It was no longer a dinner. It was a battlefield, and Althea was both judge and executioner in the court of her own making. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto Mark's, her voice dropping into a controlled whisper that carried more threat than any raised tone could. The room held its breath. Time itself seemed suspended, a moment poised on the edge of revelation. Mark and Laura both understood, in that instant, that the night would change everything. The confrontation had reached its peak, and yet Althea's plan was only beginning. As the candles flickered and shadows danced across the walls, Althea's mind turned to what must come next. The observation, the confrontation, the psychological dismantling, each step had been executed perfectly, but the final act awaited. The storm she had nurtured over 9 days was poised to break, and nothing could remain unchanged once it did. The night would not end with mere words. It would escalate into something far darker, something irreversible. The apartment had grown cold as night deepened. The faint hum of the city outside reduced to a distant, unimportant murmur. Candles flickered on the table, casting trembling shadows across the walls and onto the faces of the 3 seated there. Althea remained perfectly composed, her hands folded, her gaze sharp and calculating. The storm she had nurtured over 9 days, the humiliation, the observation, the careful plotting, had reached its apex. Tonight, the culmination of all her meticulous preparation would unfold. Mark sipped at his wine nervously, unaware that every small motion was being catalogued in Althea's mind. Lara shifted in her chair, laughing a little too brightly, her fingers nervously brushing the stem of her glass. Althea had watched them both for days, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities. Every micro-expression, every subtle habit had been stored and studied, each one a key to the unfolding moment. And now, the moment had arrived. Althea's voice broke the strained silence, calm but sharp, carrying an edge that immediately drew their attention. "I think it's time we stop pretending," she said softly, almost innocuously. Mark's smile faltered. Lara's laughter died midway, replaced by the faintest flicker of unease. The weight behind Althea's words pressed into the room like a physical force, suffocating, inescapable. No one moved. Even the air seemed frozen. She stood, slowly, deliberately, letting her movements command attention. Every step was measured, calculated to draw focus and assert dominance. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Lara, then back at Althea, realization dawning in slow, horrifying increments. The confrontation from the previous nights had been rehearsed, but this was no longer about words or accusations. This was the execution of a plan she had perfected in the shadows of humiliation, sharpened by rage and betrayals. Althea reached into her bag and retrieved a small, cold object, a blade hidden from sight until now. The glint of metal caught the candlelight, drawing Mark's eyes in disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but words failed him. Fear replaced confidence in a fraction of a heartbeat. Lara's face went pale, her eyes wide, lips trembling. Althea did not hesitate. Every step, every motion had been anticipated, rehearsed, and executed with precision. The struggle was brief. Panic flooded the room as Mark tried to lunge, but Althea's preparation ensured he had no advantage. Every move he made was countered, every reaction anticipated. Lara tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. The apartment, once a scene of domestic calm, became a battlefield of controlled violence, each act precise, each moment calculated. The chaos was immediate, raw, and terrifying, but for Althea, it was the inevitable fruition of a week of planning. In the aftermath, the room fell silent, except for the ragged breaths of those still living. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows over the still forms of Mark and Lara. Althea stood over them, chest heaving lightly, the adrenaline and fury coursing through her veins. Her hands were steady despite the enormity of what had occurred. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the grim acknowledgement that the betrayal she had suffered had demanded this response. She surveyed the scene, noting the placement of objects, the positioning of bodies, every detail necessary to maintain control. Even now, Althea's mind raced through the next steps. Cover-up, diversion, appearances. She had orchestrated the confrontation, the psychological dismantling, and the execution to perfection. The apartment, once a home, was now a stage, each shadow and reflection part of a narrative only she fully understood. Minutes passed in eerie stillness before turn. Althea moved to tidy the immediate chaos. She arranged objects, wiped fingerprints where necessary, adjusted lighting and shadows, all while maintaining the outward calm that had become her armor. In that quiet, meticulous care, she reflected on the transformation she had undergone over 9 days, the shift from a woman wronged to an orchestrator of justice according to her own rules. The act had been brutal, irreversible, but for Althea, it was the culmination of necessity, strategy, and the unflinching will to reclaim control over a life betrayed. As dawn approached, the city outside began to stir, oblivious to the horrors that had taken place within the apartment walls. Althea stood by the window, watching the first hints of light illuminate the skyline. The storm had passed, but the aftermath would demand vigilance, manipulation, and cunning to ensure her secrets remained safe. The next chapter of her life would be one of calculated deception, concealment, and the careful balancing of guilt and control. The seeds of revenge had fully borne fruit, and the consequences were only just beginning. Althea moved with precision, her movements silent, deliberate, each action weighed and calculated. The apartment bore the aftermath of violence, but she refused to allow chaos to dictate her next steps. Candles were extinguished, surfaces wiped clean, objects rearranged with almost obsessive attention. Every reflection in a mirror, every shadow cast by the city lights, was considered. The night's horror had been executed, but the danger of discovery loomed just as large. She could not afford mistakes. She donned a layer of calm, the mask that had served her throughout these 9 days now essential for survival. If anyone were to walk in, the apartment would seem untouched, peaceful even, a domestic haven untouched by any hint of the truth. Althea catalogued what needed to be hidden, what could be left to chance, and what must be actively manipulated. The bodies were concealed just enough to prevent immediate detection, and the apartment was staged as if nothing had occurred, the ordinary carefully imposed upon the extraordinary. The morning light approached, filtering through the blinds, revealing the faint traces of the previous night. Althea had anticipated this, the subtle shift in illumination, the way shadows could betray her meticulous arrangements. She moved swiftly, replacing objects, adjusting drapes, and setting a breakfast table as though the day had begun normally. When the first knock came at the door, she greeted it with practiced cheer, her expression flawless, masking the storm beneath. Friends and neighbors offered casual greetings, commenting on the apparent tranquility. Althea nodded politely. Small smiles exchanged, all the while her mind continued its relentless calculations. Every encounter required vigilance. She engaged in brief conversations, offered excuses for Mark and Laura's absence, maintained a calm that belied the reality of the previous night. Each lie was carefully measured, neither too elaborate to be suspicious nor too simple to fail. Althea's thoughts flickered back to the messages she had discovered, the betrayals she had endured, and the careful orchestration that had led to this point. Now, the responsibility of concealment fell upon her, a task that demanded both cunning and restraint. Althea reflected on the psychological landscape she now occupied. The apartment, the city, even the streets outside were her stage. Every passerby, every casual visitor, became part of the narrative she was crafting, unwitting participants in a story of deceit and survival. She catalogued what questions might be asked, what suspicions could arise, and how to steer attention away from the true events. This was no longer about revenge alone. It was about conscience, role, mastery over perception and circumstance, and the delicate art of survival in the aftermath of violence. By afternoon, she had taken deliberate steps to manipulate evidence, shifting objects, creating plausible explanations for the absence of Mark and Laura, and ensuring that no trace of her presence at the scene would betray her. She moved silently through the apartment, checking doors, windows, and lighting, confirming that everything aligned with the illusion she had created. Her hands were steady, her mind sharp, every detail accounted for. As evening approached, Althea sat by the window, city lights glimmering against the darkening skyline. The cover-up was largely in place, yet she knew vigilance could not falter. The weight of deception pressed upon her, but it was a weight she could bear. Every reflection, every flicker of light, every imagined glance from a neighbor was now part of a careful calculus, a game she would play with unwavering precision. Althea allowed herself a moment of quiet contemplation. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, yet she had survived the first day, maintained control, and hidden the evidence of her actions. But she understood that the investigation had only just begun. The following days would test her cunning, her patience, and her capacity for deception. Every choice from this point forward would matter. Somewhere beyond the apartment walls, detectives would start to trace threads of truth, and Althea would need to ensure the narrative they encountered was the one she had crafted. By the morning after the cover-up, a new energy had entered the apartment. Detectives arrived, their shoes clicking against the polished floors, cameras and notebooks in hand, professional and methodical. Althea greeted them with calm composure, smiles polite but measured, her demeanor flawless. Every movement, every word, carefully executed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. She had rehearsed this day in her mind countless times, every possible question anticipated, every reaction meticulously planned. The detectives moved with quiet efficiency, examining the apartment, inspecting the subtle details of the rooms, photographing surfaces, and questioning neighbors. Althea answered each question smoothly, her voice steady, her eyes meeting theirs without hesitation. She allowed no hint of nervousness, no flicker of guilt. To the casual observer, she was the epitome of calm resilience, a woman shaken by sudden tragedy but composed in the face of scrutiny. Inside, however, her mind raced, cataloging their movements, anticipating their lines of thought, adjusting her own explanations to fit perfectly with the narrative she had created. Forensic teams moved through the apartment, dusting for prints, scanning for traces that might betray the truth. Althea observed quietly, noting every gloved hand, every careful measurement, every camera angle. The psychological game was underway. She was both participant and observer, maintaining an outward demeanor of shocked widow while silently analyzing every step taken by those who sought to uncover the hidden reality. Each procedure, each routine check, added to the tension, but Althea had long ago mastered patience under pressure. Detectives began interviewing neighbors and friends, asking about Mark and Laura's last known whereabouts, probing for unusual behavior or suspicious activity. Althea had rehearsed these interactions, ready with plausible stories, vague details, and carefully timed omissions. Every smile she offered, every sympathetic nod, was part of the performance, a mask designed to shield the truth. She kept mental notes of their questions, their tone, their line of inquiry, mentally filing each one for later reflection and adjustment. As the hours passed, subtle cracks in the detective's assumptions emerged. The absence of physical evidence in certain areas, the careful staging of the apartment, and Althea's composed explanations began to steer suspicion away from her. She recognized the fragility of perception, how easily a well-crafted narrative could manipulate even the most thorough investigation. Every glance exchanged among the officers, every whispered observation, became a signal she could read and anticipate. The control she had exercised over her environment was now extending into the minds of those seeking to dismantle it. Despite her meticulous planning, a lingering tension persisted. The investigation by its very nature introduced uncertainty. Althea understood that every day, every step, brought new risks. Detectives could uncover what she had hidden, witnesses could recall details that contradicted her narrative, small errors could accumulate into suspicion. yet she remained outwardly composed, her movements smooth, her voice steady. Every question was met with rehearsed calm, every request anticipated and prepared for, and every observation she made fed back into her ongoing mental map of the unfolding investigation. By evening, the investigators had gathered evidence, documented statements, and departed for the night, leaving Althea alone with the apartment once more. She moved through each room, inspecting her staging, confirming that no detail had been overlooked. The tension remained, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of control maintained. Tomorrow would bring further scrutiny, new questions, and perhaps the first real challenges to her narrative. She was ready. The investigation had begun, but in her mind she had already anticipated each step, each inquiry, and the paths they might take. The game of perception and deception was far from over, and Althea intended to remain several moves ahead. Days passed under a fragile veil of normalcy. Althea maintained her careful routines, her calm demeanor now almost second nature. Friends visited, neighbors waved from the streets below, and the city continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the storm she had orchestrated. Yet beneath the surface, tension had begun to creep back in. Small inconsistencies emerged in the investigation, overlooked details that could no longer be contained entirely by her meticulous staging. The walls of her carefully constructed reality had begun to thin. Detectives returned, their questions more probing this time, their gaze sharper, their assumptions less certain. Althea greeted them as before, calm, polite, the perfect widow who had endured a tragedy too sudden to comprehend. But each word, each subtle observation from the officers, chipped at the edges of the mask she had worn so flawlessly. They had started noticing the minor details she had hoped would remain unnoticed. The faint shift in the apartment's arrangement, inconsistencies in her timeline, slight hesitations in her speech that betrayed nothing, yet implied everything. The truth, once buried beneath deception, had begun to emerge in fragments. A neighbor recalled seeing Mark and Laura together the night before the supposed disappearance. A digital timestamp contradicted her earlier statements. Forensic analysis began to reveal anomalies Althea had underestimated. Small traces, misplaced, almost imperceptible, that hinted at the violence she had orchestrated. She felt the subtle shift in the investigation like a cold wind against her carefully armored psyche. For the first time in days, a flicker of unease pierced the calculated calm. Althea spent hours revisiting her steps, replaying each moment in her mind. Every choice, every maneuver, every calculated smile now required reassessment. The perfect narrative she had crafted was no longer absolute. The threads of truth were pulling taut, threatening to unravel the illusion. She felt the weight of consequences pressing down, a reminder that control could only extend so far in a world ruled by law, perception, and human error. The adrenaline of revenge was fading, replaced by the sobering reality that her actions were no longer hers alone to command. When the detectives called her in for questioning, the session was a careful battle of intellect and perception. Althea answered with precision, offering just enough information to appear cooperative while deflecting suspicion. Every pause, every deliberate choice of words was designed to maintain authority over the narrative. She watched their reactions like a hawk, noting doubts, curiosities, and the glimmer of suspicion that could be both dangerous and instructive. Her mind was relentless, calculating the next steps, predicting what they would do before they realized it themselves. Yet despite her brilliance in manipulation, cracks were undeniable. The narrative she had imposed on reality began to strain under the weight of accumulated evidence. Questions repeated, inconsistencies were probed again, and forensic findings slowly painted a picture that matched what she had hoped to keep hidden. Althea felt a chill at the realization. No amount of calculation could fully erase the consequences of her actions. The truth, patient and inevitable, had begun to demand acknowledgement. That evening, she sat alone in the apartment, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. The silence was heavy, filled with the echoes of what had been done and what was now unavoidable. She realized that every action, every choice, every decision carried a weight beyond her control. Justice, as abstract as it had seemed, had begun to trace its way through the threads of deceit she had spun. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the acknowledgement of inevitability. Althea understood that the next days would define the final outcome. The investigation would continue, secrets would be exposed, and the consequences would follow. There was no turning back, no retreat from the path she had chosen. The perfect execution of revenge had achieved temporary satisfaction, but the cost was unavoidable. The truth had begun to surface, unstoppable, and the consequences, long delayed, were approaching like the first faint rumble of a storm beyond the horizon.